The air hung still, too still. Elias, his breath misting in the crisp autumn chill, paused at the edge of the clearing. He listened. The usual chatter of squirrels, the distant call of a hawk. They were muted, almost absent. A strange quiet had settled over the Rocky Mountains, a hush that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. He looked up. The sky, a vast canvas of deepening gray, seemed to press down, heavy with unspoken warnings. The first snows had come early this year, dusting the highest peaks with an unnatural intensity, a stark white against the dark evergreens. It wasn't just the cold, though the bite in the wind was sharper than usual for late October. It was the way the animals moved, restless, hurried, almost frantic in their preparations. Something was shifting, something profound. And Elias, a man who had spent decades reading the subtle language of the wilderness, felt a deep, unsettling tremor in his gut. This wasn't just another winter approaching. This was something else entirely. Something that would demand more than mere survival. It would demand a complete rethinking of everything they knew. Before we dive deeper into Elias's story and the choices he faced, I have a question for you. Which city are you watching this video from? Let me know in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this tale, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel for more immersive stories, and share it with someone who appreciates a good narrative. Your support helps us bring more of these hidden sagas to life. Now back to Elias and the chilling silence of the mountains. Elias wasn't a man of many words. His language was the land itself, read in the way the wind bent the pine needles, in the tracks left by a deer, in the subtle shifts of light across a mountain face. For 40 years, he had lived and trapped in the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Rocky Mountains, a free trapper beholden to no one but the seasons. He knew these peaks, these valleys, these rivers, like the back of his weathered hand. And in the late autumn of 1859, the mountains were speaking to him in a voice he'd never heard before. A low, insistent rumble beneath the usual hum of nature. The first sign was the deer. They were moving earlier than usual, a steady, nervous stream heading south, their coats already thick with winter fur. Elias watched them from a ridge, his eyes narrowed against the crisp air. Too early, he thought. Much too early for such a determined migration. He saw a buck, usually proud and defiant, pushing through the brush with a frantic energy. It seemed almost desperate. Then there were the bears. Not just the usual foraging before hibernation, but a restless, almost agitated presence. He'd found their dens, dug deeper, more frantically than any year he could remember. They were hoarding, not just eating. A squirrel, normally a darting shadow, fought another over a single pine cone with a ferocity that startled him. Every creature, from the smallest mouse to the largest elk, seemed gripped by a shared, unspoken anxiety. They knew. The weather itself was telling its own story. October had brought with it a series of cold snaps that bit harder, lingered longer than any man expected. The highest peaks, usually dusted with white by now, were already buried under what looked like a solid blanket of snow. It wasn't just falling, it was piling up, refusing to melt. The wind, usually predictable in its patterns, now shifted erratically, howling down from unexpected directions, carrying an icy sting that felt alien. He felt it on his exposed skin. It was a different kind of cold. Elias wasn't the only trapper in these mountains. A few days later, he met up with Thomas, a younger man, full of ambition and quick to laugh. Thomas was excited. "Good trapping this year, Elias," he'd declared, rubbing his hands together. "Animals are moving like crazy. We'll fill our quotas before the real freeze." Elias just nodded, his gaze sweeping the horizon, not meeting Thomas's eye. He saw the optimism, the hunger for success. He also saw the blindness. Thomas saw opportunity. Elias saw desperation. Later that week, he shared a fire with old Jebediah, a man who'd seen almost as many winters as Elias. Jebediah coughed, spitting into the flames. "Just a tough year, Elias," he grumbled, pulling his blanket tighter. "Always a few strange ones. We've seen worse." "Have we?" Elias asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. He didn't press the point. Jebediah was a man who relied on tradition, on what had always been. To suggest something truly new, truly different, was to question his very foundation. Elias watched the way the smoke curled, how it was pulled and pushed by unseen currents of air. He watched the way the ice was forming on the edge of the creek, thicker, more rapidly than it should. He watched. He listened. Something was wrong. He saw the ice on the river, too. Not the usual thin skim that came and went with the sun, but a solid, growing sheet creeping inward from the banks. It was stubborn. It was permanent. The ground underfoot had begun to harden with a deep, pervasive chill that no amount of sun could penetrate. The air itself felt denser, heavier, charged with an unspoken threat. Elias spent his days checking traps, but his mind was elsewhere. He wasn't thinking about pelts. He was thinking about survival. He was thinking about the coming months, about the long, dark stretch of winter that lay ahead. Every sign, every whisper from the wild, screamed a single terrifying message. This would not be a common winter. This would be a winter that tested everything, a winter where errors would not be forgiven. He knew that once the snows truly descended, once the passes were choked and the valleys buried, there would be no time to correct mistakes. The decisions made now in these fleeting weeks of late autumn would seal their fate. Those who followed the old patterns, who trusted in the conventional wisdom, would pay the price. A chilling wind whipped through the pines, carrying the first flakes of a heavier snow. Elias stood alone, contemplating his meager camp, the small fire that crackled defiantly against the encroaching cold. He faced a stark dilemma. Should he prepare for a typical, harsh Rocky Mountain winter, as every other trapper would, and risk everything on the hope that this year was just a tough one? Or should he listen to the unsettling whispers of the wild, embrace what others would surely call madness, and make an extreme, unconventional choice that might just be his only hope for survival? The choice weighed heavy on him, and time was running out. The dilemma that had weighed on Elias was not easily dismissed. The wild had spoken, and its message was clear. The conventional wisdom, the methods passed down through generations of trappers, felt suddenly inadequate, even dangerous. He thought of the many winters he had endured, the countless nights spent huddled by a fire, the familiar routines of camp life. But this winter, he knew, would break those routines. It would demand a new way of thinking, a radical departure from the norm. And so, Elias made his choice. He began by dismantling his existing, temporary camp. This alone seemed strange to anyone watching. Other trappers were hunkering down, reinforcing their shelters, gathering what they could before the true white blanket descended. Elias, instead, was tearing down, clearing ground, measuring distances with an almost obsessive precision. His new camp began to take shape, and it was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. The central fire, usually the heart of a trapper's world, was established a good 30 paces from where he planned his sleeping area. This was unheard of. Every experienced man knew you kept your fire close, for warmth, for cooking, for security against the night. To separate it so widely meant constant exposure to the elements, a longer walk for every ember, every cooked meal. It seemed inefficient, a needless expenditure of precious energy. His sleeping shelter, a carefully constructed lean-to against a massive pine, was then positioned. It was sturdy, well insulated with pine boughs and animal hides, but it stood alone, isolated from the warmth and light of the fire. His food stores, the dried meat, hardtack, and precious stored herbs, were then placed another 20 paces beyond the sleeping area, tucked into a natural rock crevice and camouflaged with brush. His tools, his traps, his meager supply of firewood, each had its own distinct, separated location. When Thomas, the younger trapper, stumbled upon Elias's new setup a few days later, he stopped dead in his tracks. He stared, his brow furrowed in confusion. Then a slight, disbelieving laugh escaped him. He looked from the distant fire pit to the isolated sleeping area, then back again. He shook his head. "Elias," Thomas called out, his voice carrying easily in the thin, cold air. "What in the world are you doing? You'll freeze just walking for wood." And your food, why so far? It's like you're trying to make things harder for yourself. Elias merely grunted, not stopping his work. He was meticulously arranging a barrier of fallen logs around his fire pit, not for warmth retention, but for something else entirely. He didn't offer an explanation. He didn't try to defend his choices. He simply continued, his movements deliberate, his eyes fixed on the task at hand. He knew that words would not convince Thomas or anyone else. Only time, and the mountain itself, would reveal the truth. A few days later, old Jebediah, making his last rounds before retreating to his own winter cabin, came across Elias. He surveyed the strange layout with a slow, deliberate gaze. Jebediah was a man of tradition, of methods proven by countless seasons. He didn't laugh like Thomas, but a deep sigh escaped him. He just shook his head, a look of profound disappointment on his face. He muttered something under his breath about young fools and their newfangled nonsense, though Elias was older than him. He saw it as a waste of effort, a foolish deviation from generations of acquired wisdom. He saw it as a path to certain hardship, if not worse. For Elias, the cost of being wrong was clear, stark, and absolute. In these mountains, during a winter that promised unprecedented severity, inefficiency was a death sentence. A wasted calorie, a moment too long exposed to the elements, a misjudgment of resource allocation. Any one of these could lead to frostbite, starvation, or a slow, agonizing demise. The conventional camp layout, with its centralized fire and close proximity of all essentials, was designed for convenience, for warmth, for efficiency in normal conditions. But Elias knew this wasn't normal. He was betting his very life that the old rules no longer applied. His pointless layout was, to him, a new kind of efficiency, born of a different understanding of the coming threat. The snow began to fall again, this time with a relentless determination. Flakes as big as coins drifted down, settling softly but surely, beginning to obscure the ground, to bury the familiar contours of the land. Elias watched it, his face impassive. The distances between his fire, his bed, his food stores, grew longer with each accumulating inch. The choices he had made, the effort he had expended, were now cemented into the landscape. There was no turning back. The passes were already beginning to choke with the early heavy snowfall. The valleys were becoming isolated pockets of silence. His camp was built. His decision was made. The mountain, vast and indifferent, was already beginning to swallow the world whole, leaving only those prepared to face its true fury. And Elias, alone in his strangely laid-out camp, felt the cold certainty of irreversibility settle deep within his bones. The snow didn't just fall, it descended. It came in waves, relentless and heavy, burying the world under a thick white shroud. Days blurred into weeks, then into months. For Elias, this was the season of invisible work, a solitary, grueling routine that would have broken a lesser man. His strange camp layout, once a curiosity, became the framework for his survival. Each morning, before the first hint of grey light touched the eastern peaks, Elias would rise. The air in his lean-to was cold, but tolerable, thanks to the thick layering of pine boughs and hides. His first task was always the same, to make the journey to his fire pit. It was a walk of some 30 paces, a trek that grew longer and more arduous with every new snowfall. He would move slowly, deliberately, his snowshoes sinking deep into the fresh powder. The wind often howled, whipping stinging flakes into his face. He felt the cold, he felt the bite, but he kept moving. At the fire pit, protected by its low log barrier, he would carefully uncover the embers he had banked the night before. Sometimes they were still glowing faintly, a testament to his careful preparation. Other times the cold had claimed them, and he would have to start anew, a painstaking process of flint and tinder in numbing temperatures. The fire, once lit, was a beacon, a small victory against the vast, indifferent cold. He would warm his hands, melt a little snow for water, and prepare a meager breakfast of dried meat and hardtack. After eating, the real work began. The journey to the firewood cache was another 20 paces from the fire, in a different direction. Again, he would trudge through the snow, often waist-deep, his muscles burning with effort. He would select just enough wood for the day, carefully rationing his supply. Every piece of wood was precious, a currency of warmth and life. He then carried it back to the fire, a heavy load on his back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His food stores, too, required a separate journey. Another 20 paces, in yet another direction, to the rock crevice where his supplies were hidden. He would retrieve only what was necessary, never taking more than he needed for a single day. This constant movement, this deliberate separation of his essential resources, meant that Elias was always on the move. He was always exposed. He was always working. From the perspective of anyone observing, if anyone could observe in this desolate landscape, it would seem like an incredible waste of energy. Why not keep everything close? Why not minimize exposure? Why not save precious calories by having his food, fire, and bed all within arm's reach? To the conventional mind, Elias was adding unnecessary layers of hardship to an already impossible situation. He was making his own life harder. He was losing valuable time and energy that could be spent trapping or simply resting. But Elias didn't see it that way. He saw the subtle dangers of the deep winter. He saw the way the snow piled up, how it could smother a fire, how a sudden drift could bury a shelter. He saw the risk of a single spark igniting a close-packed cache of firewood. He saw the danger of a hungry animal, drawn to the scent of food, encroaching too close to his sleeping area. His movements, though seemingly inefficient, were a constant low-level exercise. They kept his blood flowing, his muscles from atrophying. They kept his mind sharp, constantly assessing the snow depth, the wind direction, the subtle shifts in the landscape. He moved. He cleared. He maintained. Each day was a repetition of these tasks, a silent battle against the encroaching elements. The solitude was profound. The only sounds were the howl of the wind, the crunch of his snowshoes, and the rhythmic beat of his own heart. He felt the physical toll. His body ached. His hands were perpetually chapped and stiff with cold. But he continued. He had to. Have you ever faced a situation where doing something unconventional, something that seemed illogical to others, was the only way forward for you? As the weeks turned into the deepest part of winter, the cold intensified to an unimaginable degree. The snow seemed to solidify, turning into an almost impenetrable barrier. The world outside his small, precisely arranged camp became a featureless expanse of white, a silent, deadly wilderness. Elias, moving between his separated stations, felt the increasing weight of the mountain's fury. He knew the true test was still to come. He felt it in the deepening cold, in the way the air seemed to steal the very breath from his lungs. The preparation was done. The stage was set, and the mountain was about to play its hand. The true winter descended not with a roar, but with a silent, suffocating grip. It was a cold unlike any Elias had ever experienced, a deep, bone-piercing chill that seemed to drain the very warmth from the earth itself. The sky remained an unbroken, leaden gray for weeks on end, offering no hint of sun, no promise of reprieve. The snow, which had been falling steadily, now came in blizzards that lasted for days, piling up into drifts that swallowed entire trees, reshaping the landscape into an alien, hostile world. Elias's routine, already arduous, became a daily struggle against the elements. The 30 paces to his fire pit stretched into an eternity through snow that now reached his chest. The wind, a constant, malevolent presence, tore at his clothes, stinging his exposed skin. He felt the cold. It was everywhere. It was absolute. He heard reports, carried by the rare, desperate trapper who managed to make it through the passes before they completely closed. Tales of frozen rivers, of cabins buried under impossible snows, of men lost to the whiteout. The conventional wisdom, the close-packed camps designed for efficiency, were failing. Fires, kept too close to shelters, were being smothered by collapsing snowdrifts. Food caches, buried too near the living quarters, were becoming inaccessible under mountains of ice. Men were trapped, unable to move, unable to access their supplies. Elias, however, endured. His separated camp, once mocked as pointless, was now proving its strange, counterintuitive genius. The distance between his fire, his bed, and his food meant that a collapse in one area didn't threaten the others. If a heavy drift buried his fire pit, he still had his shelter and his food. If his shelter was compromised, he could still access his fire and supplies. This separation, this waste of space, was now a network of resilience. His constant movement, the daily treks between his stations, had become his salvation. It kept his blood circulating, staving off the deeper chills that settled into men who remained sedentary. It kept his pathways clear, forcing him to continually shovel and pack down the snow, creating tunnels and trenches that, while exhausting to maintain, were essential lifelines. He moved. He shoveled. He survived. Then came the storm. It was worse than anything that had come before. The wind howled like a banshee, a physical force that knocked him off his feet. The snow fell so thickly that visibility dropped to mere feet. It was a whiteout of apocalyptic proportions, a storm that threatened to erase everything. Elias was caught between his fire and his shelter when it hit with full force. He could barely see his hand in front of his face. The cold was a physical pain, gripping his lungs, burning his skin. He pushed forward, head down, fighting against the gale. He knew the direction of his shelter. He had walked it hundreds of times. But in this maelstrom, all landmarks vanished. The snow was falling so fast, piling up so quickly, that his packed down path was disappearing beneath his feet. He stumbled. He fell. He pushed himself up, his muscles screaming. He felt the insidious numbness creeping into his fingers and toes. He knew this was the moment. This was the test. He pushed on, one foot in front of the other, a primal instinct driving him. He was tired, so tired. He felt the exhaustion pulling at him, tempting him to just stop, to curl up and let the snow claim him. He saw a flash of white, a shape in the swirling chaos. Was it a tree? His shelter? He pushed harder. He stopped. He listened. The wind was a roar, but through it he heard a faint creak, a familiar sound of straining timber. It was his lean-to. He was close. He pushed the last few feet, half crawling, half stumbling, until his hand met the rough bark of the pine tree that anchored his shelter. He pulled himself inside, collapsing onto the packed snow floor, shivering violently, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was safe, for now. He lay there, catching his breath, the cold still biting, but the immediate threat of being lost in the whiteout averted. He had made it. The storm raged outside, a relentless, furious assault on the mountain. He knew it would last for days. He knew the world outside would be transformed, buried even deeper. But he was inside. He was alive. And his pointless camp, with its separated, resilient design, had just passed its most extreme test. The tension hung heavy in the air, thick with the silence of the storm's fury. What would he find when the snow finally stopped? And when the storm finally broke, it wasn't with a dramatic flourish, but with a slow, grudging retreat. The wind softened. The snow tapered off, leaving behind a world utterly transformed. Elias emerged from his shelter, blinking against the blinding expanse of white. The air was still, cold, but it carried a crisp, clean scent. He looked around. His fire pit, 30 paces away, was buried under a fresh mound of snow, but the log barrier he had built had protected the banked embers. With careful digging, he found them, still glowing faintly, a tiny ember of hope in the vast cold. He coaxed them back to life, the small flame a defiant flicker against the immensity of the winter. His firewood cache, another 20 paces in a different direction, was almost completely covered, but still accessible. The heavy snow had actually insulated it, keeping the wood dry and ready. His food stores, tucked into the rock crevice, were untouched, perfectly preserved. He surveyed his camp, the network of paths he had painstakingly maintained, now buried under feet of fresh powder. He had to dig them out again, of course. But the critical point was that each essential component, fire, shelter, food, fuel, had survived, independently. No single point of failure had brought down the entire system. What had seemed like madness, a wasteful expenditure of energy, had proven to be a robust, resilient design. Elias saw no triumph in this, no glory, only a quiet, profound validation. He had listened to the whispers of the wild, not the easy assurances of men. He had acted on an intuition that defied logic, and it had saved him. He had not just survived, he had weathered the worst winter in living memory, a winter that claimed many others. Weeks later, as the first subtle signs of spring began to appear, a slight softening of the snow, a hint of warmth in the midday sun, the first trappers began to emerge from their own, often less fortunate winter camp. They were gaunt, shaken, many having lost much of their supplies, some bearing the marks of severe frostbite. Thomas, when he finally made it to Elias's clearing, was a shadow of his former self. His usual boisterous energy was gone, replaced by a quiet weariness. He looked at Elias's camp, at the still separated stations, and his eyes held a new understanding. He didn't say anything about the pointless layout. He didn't need to. The proof was in Elias's steady gaze, in the quiet efficiency of his movements, in the fact that he was simply there, alive and relatively well. Jebediah, too, eventually appeared, older, frailer, but alive. He looked at Elias's camp with a long, assessing stare. He didn't offer praise, nor did he apologize for his earlier skepticism. He simply nodded, a slow, deliberate movement that spoke volumes. The lesson was clear, etched into the very landscape of that brutal winter. What looks like madness to many can be exactly what works when the context changes. Those who observe, who prepare, and who act quietly, often with a deep-seated conviction that defies popular opinion, are usually the ones ready when everyone else is not. It's a lesson about trusting your instincts, about questioning the established norms when the world around you is screaming for change. It's about understanding that true efficiency isn't always about saving immediate effort, but about building resilience for the unknown. Elias continued his life as a trapper, but he never forgot that winter. He never changed his camp layout. It was a silent testament to a profound truth learned in the crucible of extreme cold and isolation. The mountain had taught him, and he had listened. What do you think is the most valuable lesson from Elias's story? And finally, as you reflect on this tale, what's the weather like in your city right now?